Well, I won't forget the moment. I was actually getting up to get ready for work. It was probably just before 4 o'clock in the morning. I was working as a political correspondent for the BBC, which is something I'd done for many years. And I reacted, I think, as a journalist and as a professional rather than a human being thinking what it might mean for me. My immediate thought was, right, well, this really is a huge story. If the UK had voted to stay in the EU, we would have continued more or less as usual. David Cameron would almost certainly have stayed in power. My immediate thought was, right, this is going to be a huge story. So I simply raced to get into work and to start broadcasting. Obviously, I did have other colleagues who were there covering the story overnight. My role was to take over, to do lots of live reporting during the early morning as the events unfolded. And my God, what a day it was. Well, it's something I had thought about for weeks and months while covering the referendum campaign. And I did feel that there were strong arguments on both sides. Because one of the principles of being a political correspondent for the BBC is that you are impartial and fair to all sides, I haven't said how I voted in the referendum. And as I'm still working as an independent political analyst, I don't really want to say what my own personal view is. But I do think that the arguments were finely balanced. And I think what is extraordinary is quite how deep the divisions still are between many of those who voted on the opposing sides in the campaign. Inevitable. I think the government of the day will simply have to deliver on that historic vote. In professional terms, it's consumed a huge amount of my time and my efforts. I think there is just so much to the Brexit story, so many different aspects. Everyone will have their own individual concerns about how it will affect their family, how it will affect their business, their personal circumstances, their travel plans even. I think for me, it has been about trying to understand and get to grips with what's going to happen to all the different aspects. And of course, a huge amount of this has yet to be negotiated. And even after we technically leave, an awful lot will still have to be negotiated in the transition period. On a personal level, I wouldn't say it has affected me hugely. I think one of the big concerns is that with children who've recently graduated from university, I do just hope that they will have the freedom to travel and work across Europe, just as I hope that lots of people from across Europe will still come to this country and enrich our lives here. Well, it's fascinating because, of course, all the polls suggested that the country was going to vote to remain in the EU. I'd been working on the campaign, and as part of that, I'd been out and about around the country with different sides. And both myself and my colleagues at the BBC in the political unit all came back with anecdotal but similar stories about how as soon as you went outside London, the mood felt very different. If you walk down a high street in Essex, in the Midlands, in the north of England, down in the southwest, it was suddenly very difficult to find anyone who wanted to stay in the European Union. There were huge numbers of very vocal people saying that it was time to get out of the EU. So I always thought that there was a chance the country could vote to leave. And although there was a moment of some surprise, some shock when the final announcement came, I think actually there were many, many signs in the run-up to that vote which gave us a real indication of which way the country was going. Well, it's clearly a very, very complex issue and a very sensitive one given the history of the conflict on the island of Ireland. And it's also potentially a sticking point in the entire negotiating process. Now, if you talk to people who have been involved at government level, they think that there is a way through this. They think that if we have got the right trade agreement and the right technology, that a hard border, which could perhaps inflame tensions, can be avoided. I think it's difficult because inevitably the Republic of Ireland will be in the EU, Northern Ireland will be out of the EU. I think this backstop suggestion which the EU is talking about, which is that you have a customs union of the whole of Ireland, I don't think that's going to work because of the sensitivities and the fact that Northern Ireland is a part of the UK, so you'd have to have a customs union involving the whole of the UK, and that's something that's been ruled out. But I think that as with all of these things, with some goodwill, with some technology, and and it is a big if, we get a decent trade deal, then I think a way through this can be found. And I think that there is a greater willingness now to try to find a way through this. Well, the question I'm asked most often, not necessarily on air, but just by friends and colleagues, people who are outside the process, is do I think Brexit is going to happen? And my answer is yes, I think it is, because the UK has voted to leave. The Article 50 process has been triggered. Leaving the European Union is the default position. That could only really be overturned by another vote of the people, either in an election or another referendum. And there is no major party in this country that is committed to doing that. So the chances of the Brexit vote somehow being overturned and Brexit being derailed in the next year are very, very slim indeed. We've been through some hugely turbulent times. I wouldn't want to rule it out altogether, but I do think it's going to happen. But I think that as long as there is an agreement and as long as we get the transition phase, an awful lot of people in this country on the day after Brexit will say, well, hang on, what has really changed? Because I think a lot of the big changes about what's going to happen on trade, on the rights of citizens, on the Northern Ireland border, are all going to be pushed off into the transition period. And it won't be until that ends at the end of 2020 that we'll see some real changes. Having said that, I think it will be a historic moment when the UK leaves the EU. We don't yet know how that's going to be celebrated or commemorated. And I think what we will see after that will be evolving changes. There will undoubtedly be some problems, some hiccups, some times when people simply don't know how things are going to work once the old rules and regulations have been abandoned. But I think sector by sector, bit by bit, it'll be in everyone's interest to make it work. And I certainly hope that's what's going to happen.